Russ. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a little bit of fun with our podcast guests, and naturally, I've had a little bit of a head start having known you for a while, but I still thought I would do my fun AI process. We both jumped on the AI trend a few weeks ago where we would say to ChatGPT, come up with a caricature of me based on what you know about me. I think you've got yours as one of your social media photos or something. I said, who is Russ Dyble? I'm interviewing Russ Dyble today. Who is he? And this is what
Okay.
Claude, I actually used Claude this time. So this is what Claude says. And it says, ladies and gentlemen, prepare to be inspired by someone who lives and breathes property, from investment and HMO development to lettings, systems and coaching. Russ Dyble is an entrepreneur, an investor, a landlord and a multi-business owner based in the UK. He's the driving force behind several property enterprises and brand ventures active in the residential investment and rental sector. It says that Russ's property journey stretches far beyond spreadsheets and refurb budgets. He's a serial property fanatic whose passion for creating well-designed, income-producing homes has earned him a strong reputation among UK landlords and investors alike. Outside of business, Russ is known for mentoring and supporting other property investors, sharing insights rooted in hands-on experience rather than theory. He champions the practical, everyday work required to build successful portfolios, especially in the HMO and multi-let space. On the personal side, Russ's life story includes formative experiences such as his involvements in scouting, which he has credited with helping shape his leadership ethos, teamwork skills and commitment to helping others grow. He's a family-orientated individual and firmly rooted in the community, believing strongly in creating positive impact both through property and through personal example. So if you're ready to learn from someone who's built systems, scale portfolios and helps others to do the same, please join me in welcoming Russ Dyble to the podcast. So welcome again, Russ.
Thank you very much. You sound like a nice guy.
So, as I say, we've known each other for a while, and what strikes me about you, Russ, is that you're not just a property investor. You've been running groups of businesses that sit around property, from lettings through to the furnishing side, the sourcing side, and now doing development work. But before we get into some of that big stuff, just paint the picture for our listeners in your own words, who you are and how did all of this come together?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, I'm Russ. Along with my partner Lucy, we've got a number of businesses. We've got 2 kids together as well. It's a family affair, family business. I'm not sure they're that keen on us leaving them the lettings agency in the will, but I think some of the portfolio they're not too fussed about. They'll take those. We do live and breathe it. We've got a great team around us in the businesses as well. I started investing, well, I started as an accidental landlord actually, probably 2012. I let out a flat that I'd lived in. I actually bought that flat around about the time of the 2008 crash, and I listened to my bank manager dad tell me to fix my mortgage for 5 years. Mortgages could go up to 15%, like when he bought his property, and within 6 months the mortgage rates had gone down to practically 0%, and I was left on a fixed 5-year mortgage of about 5.5%, which at the time felt quite high, but of course 15 years on feels like that's kind of normal. Yeah, so that's that. And a few years later, I moved in with my then partner, looked at the property. It was negative equity at the time, short lease, there was a few issues, and decided to rent it out and sort of, hope there was a bit of recovery and see what we do with it after that. So a couple of years later, that had happened, and you kind of like, oh, actually, these tenants have paid down my mortgage, and the ship has kind of righted, and things are in a bit better position now, and this is good. Maybe I should look at this. Lots of people tell me you're a landlord, you're property guru because you rent out one property and what have you at that time. And so we'd had a look, and we started to look around at maybe a couple of other buy-to-lets with some inheritance that she'd received at the time. And through that looking, I ended up seeing an advert for a property training company fronted by a footballer from the 90s who I recognised. And sort of went down that path, did a bit of education. That's obviously how we met, through that training company. Did their training, got committed in quite a big way, and then started buying buy-to-lets, doing the refurb refinance model, buying properties for 50, 60,000 pounds, spending 15,000 pounds on them, valuing them up at 90 to 100,000, pulling the money out and going again. So that's really how it started. And then the first kind of half of the I hate the word journey, but for ease of use, the journey started. And then when I met Lucy, I was asked to come in and join what ended up being Rent-A-Room, the managing agency. She'd got a sourcing company, hit a problem that they'd sourced a few properties and didn't really have any good management to hand over to. So I was asked to come in and give some advice on the system side of things. And then through sort of various combinations of events, we ended up 50-50 in the business, and it's grown from there. So it started at 2 houses with 8 rooms between them. Our staff meeting every day involved going through every single tenant, what they'd had for breakfast, what they wore, what colour the hair was that day. And we're now at 550 let rooms, 600 on the books. We've got 120 in the pipeline in the sourcing business. So that's the sort of the scale and how we got to where we are through COVID, through having another baby. Yeah, it's been an interesting ride.
It sounds like it's been a busy, but like you say, very interesting and rewarding one, it sounds like.
Yeah.
So you got to that point, that obviously builds a lot of experience, doesn't it? Lots of highs, lots of lows, lots of sort of war wounds, ready to perhaps take it a little bit bigger. And I know recently, over the last few years, the focus has been more so on these bigger commercial projects. So I'd love to understand at what point you kind of took that plunge to say we're going to go big,
Yeah.
and why I think you've kind of stayed in that space. We'd love to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so for us, like I said, I started off doing the smaller terraced houses, really good foundation. A number of those were HMOs, very basic HMOs with shared facilities. They've now gone back into being single lets. And that's just kind of an evolution. Those properties that now best served, as single lets. We then built a couple of 6-bed HMOs, all en suites, which Lucy and I own together. Our typical model on the sourcing side for clients is like taking a 3-bed terraced house into a 4-bed, 4-bathroom, so generally 3 en suites and 1 off suite. And the numbers on those will generally work for people with a reasonable stack of cash, maybe time limited, looking for return on investment to around about the 20% mark. And we weren't in that position. So we had to get a better return on investment out of the properties that we were looking to do. So the 6 beds, it made sense because you've got the 2 extra rooms. A lot of the fixed costs are generally the same. And then an opportunity came up to buy an old social club for not a lot more than the cost of the house that we would turn into a 6-bed. And we thought, it can't be that hard. It can't be that much more expensive. And we took, how much it cost us to convert a property into a 6-bed HMO, times it by 3 to get 18 rooms. And like, yeah, okay, we could do that, but a few £100,000 on the refurb, that'd be fine. And we just kind of, let's go for it.
Yeah.
And we went for it slightly naively. We learned a lot from that first property. Interestingly, it was actually the first one we started, but not the first commercial one we finished, which in itself is quite a story.
Yeah.
And we just kind of, what it's allowed us to do as well is to provide bigger rooms than a lot of the terraced houses. And whilst most people want your kind of 12, 15, 18 square metre room with the ensuite, what the commercial ones allow us to do is to have more studio type rooms. So they're sort of a hybrid. They're still HMOs by definition, but the rooms are generally around 18 to 20 square metres. They've got the ability to have a small cooking area, a little hob, no ovens, but a little hob and a sink in the rooms, fridge freezer in the room, and then still have the communal space. So you've still got that communal living. They're not kind of like your old bed sits, as in that's your room and that's it. So there's still that communal living, but there's more of that ability to cook in the rooms. And it really interesting what we find is we find that people cook in the rooms but go and eat in the communal space, whereas we felt that maybe will the kitchenettes be popular and will people use them because cooking in the rooms or whatever. But yeah, actually people quite like cooking in their own space, having their own stuff, but then they still want the shared space to go out and live with other people and make friends. And so a lot of our tenants are in their mid-20s to mid-30s. So often they are single people or they're people with a partner but not living with a partner. So they're wanting that lifestyle as well. And we just felt that for us, the volume would come from the 4-bed, 4 bathrooms. But for our own properties, that we would meet the need of people that wanted bigger rooms. And a lot of our clients are not wanting to take planning risk, not wanting to do refurbs, that are 6 figures and in some cases 7 figures plus.
Yeah.
That's not their appetite. So we've kind of grown using our knowledge of managing hundreds of rooms. We could see and hear from people that they wanted something different, but that only a small section of the population wanted that different. So we wouldn't go and source 10 Chilvers House or the Crowns a year, but to do one a year for ourselves kind of is about the right volume to bring to the market.
That's good. And let's talk about the social club then. So did it work out as a 6-bed HMO times 3?
The slightest. A
Yeah.
6-bed HMO times 18 probably, but
And what was, on reflection on that, what do you think maybe was your biggest learning doing that one for the first time?
so I think so we definitely misunderstood the translation from doing 1 6-bed to 18 beds being 3 times 6 beds. So the change from 6 to 7 rooms, we knew that would require the sui generis planning, but also the building control requirements, because it then becomes a change of use. They then had we were applying a lot of 2 and 3 bed house refurb spec to a 2-story commercial building. So although it was 2-story, building control wanted a fire panel, and not just a fire panel, but also with repeaters around the buildings and multiple panels. So that didn't equate, we were like, well, it's a two-story building. Like the worst case, you've got to jump out of a first floor window. Why are we not following the LaCourse guidance? Yeah, well, LaCourse says that if it's a 2-story building, you don't need that. Where building control change and compartmentalizing and the difference between rooms for residential purposes and rooms in a house are quite different. So essentially they were looking at it as a hotel and applying those standards, whereas in a 6-bed HMO they were saying, yes, this is still fundamentally a house in which multiple people live. So we hadn't translated fully at that point, whereas now we've done it. After learning that, the next few we then built that into the costs and whatever. The other thing as well is we started with the refurb team that had done our smaller refurbs, and we wanted them to grow with us. And whilst I think probably working on just that one project, certainly the project manager, the main contractor, was probably capable of being the site manager. He didn't have the infrastructure and the size of the subcontractors to bring in to do a job of that size. And then the not having the development funding, so we had a smaller budget than it ended up costing, and we thought we can raise that money. That sort of stilted. We get to a point where, okay, we don't have the money, so we stop. And then, of course, the build team are out of sync. You lose subcontractors, and there's a cost of remobilising the team back on site. So definitely using development funding once you cut your teeth and they want to lend to you. I mean, the Crown that we've just done, that's nearly £1 million. That's probably the easiest project we've funded from a funding perspective, because once the bank say they're happy to fund it, that's the money flows. Whereas when you're trying to raise it yourself and it's 20,000 here and 50,000 there, it's very bitty. Whereas if the bank say yes, you're like, okay, well, if the valuer says yes, we're onto a pretty good thing. They've already valued it. They've checked the numbers on the refurb. We've got a contract administrator who's pulled everything together. In a way, the planning is the bit you don't control. Whereas once you get beyond that, you've almost got less variation than in a 6-bed. So yeah, that's the sort of stuff we've learned on the bigger ones.
Yeah, I think everyone's had that one sort of deal that you learn a lot on, but it also becomes quite a life-changing deal, doesn't it? Because you learn so much, but at the end of it, you think we did it, and then you're ready to then move on and do bigger and better and do it in a slightly different way, like the Crown that you mentioned. The Crown was a pub, or was it a hotel?
It was a pub when we bought it. It had been a hotel. It had sort of various things, but yeah, essentially it was a pub, hotel, pub with rooms, pub with a function room.
And how did that differ out of interest in terms of a pub conversion versus, say, a social club or a block of offices or so on? Did that have any nuances that you needed to take into consideration with it being a pub?
So the planning side of things, being a pub, we thought it would be harder because of the community interest. It's a very prominent building in the town centre. Everybody's been in the pub at some point in the town. Everybody's very attached to it emotionally, but that didn't really come through in the planning application. The planners kind of took the view that it's been derelict for a number of years. We would like something to happen with it. I mean, we could do a whole podcast just on the planning process for that building and the ridiculous rules that planning officers and
Yeah.
consultees introduced. But on the whole, the planning wasn't particularly a challenge. We changed our mind to initially we got planning for it to be 10 flats, and then
Okay.
that was around the time that the valuation office, the challenge to the banding, council tax banding on rooms was. So once that was settled, the 10 flats wasn't the optimum scheme, but we were worried that we do 18 HMO rooms and then we get 18 lots of council tax on it.
Yeah.
That would completely kill the deal. So once that was kind of dealt with, we were like, well, actually, why don't we just go back and do what we do really well, which is rooms. This building lends itself brilliantly to it, like where the windows are, literally, we just want to put walls between each of the windows, and that's the perfect size room. It being 120 years old threw up some challenges. The big gable wall on the front, which is quite ornate, we had to take that down. The planners were very keen on that being built back, very like for like. We took out, there's a big stone shield on the front, which weighed just over a ton, which luckily it came out as a number of individual pieces, and we've put it back on. We've had a like laser cut replacement about 2/3 of the size that's then bolted on two pieces. But yeah, essentially that was a ton of material sat within a single skin brick gable wall with no support, no reinforcement, and the structural engineer just had a heart attack. When he saw it, it was literally panic stations. I was like, it's lasted 120 years. It's probably
Yeah.
going to make another couple of weeks. And I said to him, will you stand by your calculations lasting another 120 years on what we rebuilt? And he said no. And I thought that was very telling.
Oh.
He might have panicked, but it stood for 120 years and hadn't fallen over, but we had to rebuild it.
Yeah. And so was that a stipulation in planning, or was that a goodwill gesture for the community, or did that come up in some sort of conservation or listed situation, or this whole shield?
So the shield, there's a lot of misinformation so locally that the pub was listed, and this idea of it being locally listed, which isn't listed, but it's on a list somewhere. So that luckily there was none of that. But the planning permission did say that we had to, if we would use materials, they had to be very similar. You know, we couldn't fundamentally change the look of the outside. So when the gable wall, there was no plans to take that down originally, but as we got to partway through the build, we realised that this whole sort of gable wall across the thing with the 1.2 ton of shield was just sat on a rotten timber. It became a variation, something we had to deal with. So then we went back to the planners, and they were very much, so it's kind of like runs the whole way along the building, and then there's a sort of triangle, and then the shield's in the middle. One of the things we talked about was, can we just rerun the gable wall straight across? And they were pretty adamant that no, we had to rebuild the shape, and they wanted the original shield built back into it.
Right.
And we just said, look, it's come out in 20
It's
pieces.
crumbled.
It's rubble. Yeah, it's not going to go back in. And so then they said, well, can you replace it with something similar? And a few eagle-eyed people. So it used to say the Crown Hotel was the wording in the old shield, and it now says 2025 Crown House. And there's been a few people that have commented that they have changed the shield and they have put the wrong information back up. And we were like, well, if we're going to put it back up, it'd be nice to reflect that change. And ultimately that isn't the original building. That 120-year-old building isn't the original Crown Hotel. So
it's not.
Nothing is original.
It's not.
It's just what you remember, what the modern memory. So yeah, so there's just a few challenges around that. There was a few working around solid walls, but that's the same with any building. We could have knocked it down. Arguably, it probably would have cost the same to knock it down and rebuild the whole thing from scratch, but we didn't feel that was the right thing to do.
If you did that, you could have put your family coat of arms on a shield, perhaps. And really given into the community. I've got a question coming up about the community, actually. But before that, there has been quite an increase in commercial conversion applications in the UK. I was looking at some stats that over the last few years, it's increased by about 63%, which is good because a lot of these buildings are empty, derelict, and good for nothing. Are you seeing much competition when you're out procuring these buildings, or not really?
Not really. I mean, we've got a bit of a reputation now for buying bigger buildings in the area. So we're now in that kind of, the agents will call us and undoubtedly half a dozen other people probably, but it's not like when you get a call to, oh, you're the first one we've called about this 3-bed terraced house. You're like, yeah, okay. But yeah, so there's not a huge appetite for them, certainly in their current use. People aren't looking at offices as offices. They're not looking at the old bank as a new bank. We're getting the call, can you do something with this, flats or rooms? Or we've got some other ideas bubbling away for a couple of buildings we've been offered that are not residential accommodation, but they will be like very small units within a big building. Because even businesses now, but businesses are shrinking down, people working from home, and
Yeah.
things are changing. Pubs aren't being run as pubs anymore. If you can't have a decent kitchen in there, they're not really working as wet pubs. Those kind of things. There's definitely a change in use for buildings, and blocks of offices that are already either segmented up into rooms or flat sizes, or are basically just clear it all out the stud work and start again. Perfect. When we've got so much demand for accommodation, you can see why planners are quite keen, and you can also see why politically people are exercised about change. And it was my favourite pub, and it's been empty for 6 years, and kids have been putting the windows through, and
It's
nobody's going to
it's not a
spend
pub.
£1 million on it being a pub again. I'm really sorry, it's not a pub, but
Well,
it's not.
let's just talk about that for a minute, because the last development that we did was also a pub on the ground floor that then had sort of rooms above, a mix of function rooms, bedrooms, I guess, a real hodgepodge of activity above the pub. And it wasn't a listed building, but we was told it was a building of special interest. So I said, oh, well, what does that actually mean? And it appears it basically means sort of that the conservation officer can pop round and make up the rules
Stick them all in.
and tell you what they want. But they were kind of do what you want on the inside, don't do too much to the outside if you can help it. But it was quite a light touch of guidance, which was fair enough because it was very ornate and it was 1800s. And we actually revelled in the fact of wanting to keep it looking as it did, because it was a gorgeous building. But we had a lot of kickback from the local community. But some of the comments just felt so spurious, because we had some particular ladies that took a lot of issue that it was a pub and that it would be open until I think 1 a.m. on a late license, and there'd be loads of cars and people smoking outside, and it was a quite well visited pub and they didn't like the noise, but then thought that I think it was a 19-bed application at the time, was going to be so antisocial. And I said, look, we're not going to have 100 people in a pub outside smoking, drinking, nothing of the sort for an HMO. But what we found was that the local community didn't get what we were trying to achieve, didn't get what our vision was. Have you had the same kickback in your areas, and how have you tried to work with the councillors and the community on that?
Yeah, we definitely see the same thing. There's every planning application goes on Nuneaton News and Coventry Live, and straight away, you get a half a dozen people just put HMO. You're like, yep, well done, you've read the application.
Yeah.
And then the next lot are immigrants, spelt wrong, IMMURGRUNTS, and boat people. And that's 24 hours of that, and then it all goes quiet. So Nuneaton's got quite a high number of HMOs that have been handed over to Serco, and there are some integration issues. We've just, in the last couple of weeks, had a guy convicted of a really serious sexual assault. So there's a very heightened feeling that HMOs equal bad people. And we've kind of been tarred with that brush a little bit, which is a shame, because all of ours are working professionals. We don't do any asylum claims, and we don't do any probation, and all of those things have a place, but that's not what we do. But they do need closely managing. But as soon as our boards go up, as soon as our planning application goes in, another HMO, we don't need that. Like, well, you don't, but you're a middle class family that live in a 3-bed semi-detached house. People that are saving or working as care workers, or whatever the reason they want to live in a HMO, they want to live in it right now. That might not be where they want to live forever, but right now that's the right accommodation for them. So why don't you let us, a bit like you don't see our vision, the Crown and the ones that we do, even our smaller ones, are all through Furnish My Property, all really well designed, very stylish. We're appealing to that 25. We know our market is 25 to 35. Those people don't want to live in a Magnolia box, and we don't particularly want them to live in a Magnolia box either. And neither do we want them to live in an identikit house that looks the same as every other HMO in the town as well. So we do a lot to make sure that each one is individual, very stylish. We do see some of our tenants putting on Instagram, look at my new place, and they're kind of suggesting that the whole thing is theirs. And
Why?
But yeah, so we get a lot of pushback, and we've done recently, we've got a few applications in for our 6 beds to go sui generis to have 7 occupants. And we've had a lot of people, we're very concerned about the safety of the people in these buildings. You're like, no, you're not. You're objecting to the fact it's a 6 bed HMO, but you only know that because we've applied for it to be a 7 bed.
Yeah.
And actually, it's been there for 12 years and you've not complained once.
Yeah.
There are no issues. The council have confirmed there's no issues with the licence. There's been no environmental health complaints. So all of your building control have signed it off. So all of your kind of, we're concerned that there's too many people in the property. We're concerned about antisocial behaviour.
Yeah.
None of these things have actually come to pass. Meanwhile, you've actually built a wall without planning permission on the side of the road. You smoke weed. We had one the other day where I actually asked the planning officer to put the picture in his presentation. One of the neighbours had complained that property would not be well kept. So I went and took a picture out of our back window of our garden and his garden. And his garden is a complete tip. And I redlined our garden, which we've had cleared. And, it's not landscape by any stretch, but it's cleared.
Yeah.
And the planning officer literally couldn't not laugh when he put it up and talked it through. It was like, we had an objection from the neighbour indicated on the right of this property that the applicant is not maintaining their property well enough. And it was like, you could literally, everybody in the room was just sniggering at the the hypocrisy of it. And in the end, he came up to me at the end and he said, look, I do need to tidy my garden up a bit.
Oh, he was in the room.
He was one of the people objecting, yeah. So he lives one side and his sister lives the other, and it's her that she spoke, and it's her that's built the wall that needed planning permission. She built a 2 metre wall alongside a road. It needs planning. So we're like, right, okay. Now we've got ours. We'll see what plannings think about your breach of planning, shall we?
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's that kind of, and I get it, because that building in particular is a good example. Previously was let to a domestic violence refuge, and they had a number of people living in there, and the conditions were appalling. We bought it, and it was like, you and I would walk in and be like, cha-ching. There's leak, there's black mold, there's carpet. It's terrible, and people were living in there, and they'd had the issues with. But generally, it was women being moved out, and they'd have the boyfriends turning up in the middle of the night, kicking off. And I kind of like, do you know what? I get that. That's fair comment, because you've had issues in the past. But this has been operating as a HMO for 6 months now, and you've had no issues at all with the current tenants. Like, if you came inside and saw the quality of accommodation, you'd probably accept begrudgingly that it was quite nice.
Yeah.
But it's easier just to make assumptions.
It is, and I think it's fair. Some of these things that they raise are fair, if they didn't know the sort of outfit that you are and how you operate. But it's when it becomes illogical that it really sort of starts to get to me a little bit. We've had one, one local resident said, would you have facial recognition CCTV outside the property, so at any point we can see who's coming in and who's coming out and know who they are? Well, no. And
would you have that outside your home?
And I thought, what, something like that you get in an airport or something? What technology are you?
Body scanners.
Yes. And I just said no. And then, can you guarantee that nobody in the house is going to smoke? And I said, no, I can't. We have a no smoking policy, but I can't guarantee these things, and nor can you guarantee it if a family moved in next door to you in a 3-bedroom semi. We just can't guarantee them. Can you guarantee that they're not criminals? I said broadly yes, because of some of the referencing checks that we do. Can you guarantee they're not all going to hang out the window and smoke weed? And I thought, have you ever seen 18 people all hanging out the window smoking a joint? It's so unrealistic. But that's that's their fears. But on this particular project, once it was done, completed, we've had no issues there whatsoever, no calls of antisocial behaviour. We put a little smoking area sort of round the side where nobody can see. There's no issues at all. But when I go to the property now and I bump into one of them in the street, they don't even give me eye contact because it would kill for them to say, oh, actually, this thing has worked out exactly as you said it was going to,
Yeah.
But it doesn't really bother me particularly, because our agenda and focus is something completely different. But it is one that I think as HMO owners we have to grapple with, one that perhaps you don't learn on the courses and on the programs. This is just it's real life, isn't it? It's dealing with
Yeah.
people's real life stuff. I know you've just
Well,
focused on community. I know that you actually do quite a lot of give back in your community. I was looking at some stuff on social media, which I thought was brilliant in terms of like sponsorship. Perhaps just share with us a little bit more about that. I think that's really good.
yeah, so I mean, the area that we cover a number of areas, but what the main one where we've got most of our rooms is an old market town, about 110,000 people. So it's quite a small community. People know the businesses in the area, and we're keen to do that. So we sponsor one of the local football clubs. We're not the main sponsor, but if every business chips in £1,000 a year, and you can get 100 businesses to do that,
Mm.
suddenly that football club has a real chance to bring through new talent, provide that facility in the community, rebuild their stadium, all that good stuff. And the boxing gym that Lucy's in as well, we've kitted out. They've got a number of young lads there that boxing is that's their structure. That's their kind of their main hobby. And the two guys that run it are really good role models for them. And some of those lads, there's a lot of the lads there, just normal run of the mill guys, but some of them do need, have needed that father figure role. And, they're just kind of looking to get into some of the organised fights and whatever. And, some of the costs having the tracksuit, having the kit and the gloves, it's a little bit prohibitive for them. And, we said, you want to step in £100 a month, we'll give you that. Let the club just, if people need stuff to get them
Yeah.
going on their first kit, that's what that's for. So yeah, we like that. We're quite good at partying as well. So we'll have normally around about once a quarter we'll have a party, and we like to use kind of like all the local suppliers, so like Balloon Lady and local DJ, local pub, local buffet catering. So we kind of trying to put back a lot of money into the local business as well, and then interestingly, it comes around because then they'll tell people, oh, these rentering people, oh, we did the balloon arch for the crown opening. We couldn't believe how nice the rooms are. And,
Yeah.
so it does start to then come back to you that those people then tell other people, and those people are, oh, okay, so maybe they're not the devil incarnate housing. And just going back to the previous point though, about the people's expectations as well. Last year, we took out nearly 50 rooms out of the managed portfolio, working with landlords where the houses probably are 8, 10 years old, maybe have, if you're likely to have those issues. Where we have issues, they're generally men in their 20s and early 30s who do smoke weed and struggle to hold down a job. And we did have a few issues with some of those people. And with the renters' rights bill come in May, landlords are looking at, do I keep taking a chance on those people? And actually, interestingly, with taking some of those people out of the portfolio, I think in a sense, because we focused on, okay, who are our challenging tenants and what we can do about them, it has kind of just reminded us a little bit that some people do live next to people that we hope that are maybe not the people that you would want to live next to.
Yeah.
And that probably does come with having the cheaper rooms and, to an extent. So we have managed those, and interestingly, there are people in the town that are doing some of the bigger blocks that are 6.5, 7 square meter rooms, all share facilities. And I'm thinking, you're getting our troublesome tenants. Like
Yeah. They're coming
that's
your
where
way.
they're going. And
Yeah.
I kind of interestingly, some of those actually haven't made it through planning. And I kind of wonder whether that is the planners twigging that if
Hmm.
you do decent sized rooms where people can afford a bit better, you are going to get better quality, and that cramming people in literally into rabbit hutches and lots of them, you are going to concentrate. And that's where I think maybe the planning process has started to work a bit better, to be fair to them, which
And that's them
I won't
understanding
be for too long.
you. Yeah, don't put your hopes too high. But you think that's potentially them understanding you and your business rather than just seeing it as another HMO.
Yeah, and I think also us understanding that, like you say, planning is a very logical process. So I go into those meetings thinking I'm pretty nailed on here that we're going to win, because one of our developments was an 18 bed in a road with limited parking. It was close to the town centre. The planning consultant said, look, legally you cannot lose. Okay,
Mm.
whether or not politically the councillors
Yeah,
decide to make a decision you
yeah,
can challenge.
yeah.
And the lawyer actually said that the chair brought it to a vote, and the lawyer interrupted, very, very unusual, and said, I just want to make clear to members that there is no legal grounds to object to this application. The developer would be well within their rights to bring a challenge,
Yeah.
and I expect that they would win, and the council would therefore bear the costs of all of that.
Yeah.
So whilst you have the ability to vote against, I want you to understand that the legal advice I'm giving you is that you will lose on appeal. And one of the councillors and the chair of the committee then spoke and said, look, I don't like it, but they've met all our policies. If that means that our policies need reviewing,
Yeah.
that's what we need to then look at. But on this occasion, and these were his words, we need to hold our nose and vote for it.
Hold on.
Uh,
The thing is, that sounds like a real drop the mic moment with that solicitor,
yeah,
doesn't it? And it was just like, boom. Because it's very emotional. And I remember being in a situation just for a little 5-bed, probably 10 years ago. And I was in the town hall, I think it was a Crewe. And you'll laugh at this, Russ, because it was my first where planning got pushed to committee. And so I thought, right, I'm going to prepare for my, speech that I'm going to give at the committee meeting, and I'm going to make sure I get this through. And I was there with the architect, but I just went on my own and thought, I've got this. And I didn't realize you only got what, 200 seconds or something, 3 minutes to put forward your case. And obviously, I've got this long speech that started with, hello, my name's Amanda Woodward. Let me introduce you to my company, blah, blah, blah. Before I knew it, they rang the bell, said, you've run out of time, take a vote. And it was a unanimous no. And I just felt like they'd chewed me up and spat me out. And I remember
yeah,
going next was actually Bentley Motors. Obviously, the Bentley motor production line in Crewe, they were applying, I think, for more car parking spaces or something. And the guy from Bentley got up, and there was like no airs, no graces, no introduction. He just went, you need to accept this because it meets your policy, because. And I sat there and thought, yeah, I got this one completely wrong. Completely wrong.
yeah.
You've really
It's
got
very
to.
much a process. We did the same. So we'd been prepped with a speech from the planning consultant, but
Yeah.
actually when we'd read what the planning officer was going to propose, he sent us his presentation before. I actually said to Adam, the planning consultant, look, the guys literally used the words, there are no legal reasons to object in his presentation. He's listed all the policy, everything. I was like, I don't need to say that all again because he said it. Like, what can our 3 minutes be? And in the end, we actually used the 3 minutes this time. We started off with, I'd like to thank the officer for confirming there are no legal reasons to object to this planning. What we would like to do is spend 2.5 minutes addressing the residents' concerns, which we understand.
Yeah.
And so we dealt with the logical bit quite quickly. And to be fair, the planning officer had done a really good job of doing it for us, but kind of like used it as like yes, this is a process, but we do understand where your concerns have come from. We're not just here saying, oh, well, look, we've won the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that there were some questions about fire safety and whatever, and they were batted back. Obviously, that's not a planning consideration.
Yeah.
And we've written to the councillors separately to say, look, if you'd like to come around, we'll show you why actually our house is probably safer than any other house on that road.
Absolutely.
Which interestingly, he's not taken us up on the offer of doing that yet. But
Yeah, they're busy all of a sudden. It's crazy. Let's just segue a little bit into renters' rights. I think we can't have podcast episodes these days, unfortunately, without talking about it. You said you've had a bit of a clear out. When you said 50 rooms, I didn't know if you meant you'd close them down or give them back to the landlords, or you'd actually just basically sort of re-tenanted them, have you, those 50? What do you actually have to them?
yeah, it's a small handful of people that are kind of, they've been in a bit in arrears, a bit not, a bit, they're a bit messy, and then we've moved, help, just said to the landlord, look, it's going to get a lot harder to move these people on come the 1st of May. So
Yeah.
if you're sticking with them, you're sticking with them, but if you're not, we need to do it now.
Yeah.
But the majority of those rooms actually are the old 4-bed, 1-bathrooms, where we've, a bit like I've done with my own portfolio that's 10 years old, turn them back into single lets. There's a huge demand for single let houses, a smaller demand for the shared facilities, more of our arrears, antisocial behaviour, non-payment, voids are in those properties as well. So we kind of said to the landlords, look, I don't think this situation is going to get any better. And the risk you run is that come the 1st of May, you end up with 3 rooms filled and 1 empty. And one of those 3 is not necessarily the best tenant, not always paying on time, causing issues. And you end up in a position where you're not even breaking even, but potentially losing. Or we can take out all of those holding costs and go back to mortgage management, gas safety with a family let. because you're not having to take all the en suites out.
Yeah.
So what we've done is taken out, you know, of those 50 rooms, we've then got probably 40 tenants that we would happily rehouse. We've upgraded them. Essentially, they have to pay a little bit more, but they can afford it and they're happy to do so. And then we've taken out the 20% of those tenants that, yeah, we'd live with them now, but the effect of that legislation is that landlords are choosing not to take the risk going forward. And I think that's certainly in our council, they're not ready for that. They don't understand that that process is happening, and by the middle of the year, they're going to have a load of 20 to 30-year-old lads generally that smoke weed and can't hold down a job turn up at their door and say, rent a room, won't rent to me.
Yeah.
I haven't got anywhere to live. And where they'll end up is in, you know, the landlords, the private landlords that aren't doing as many checks, the lesser quality HMO. And then I think you will end up with, again, probably another round of, oh, there's a HMO at the end of my road and it's full of people that smoke weed.
Yeah.
But it won't be ours.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so there's a little bit of a reshuffling going on. I think, you know, across the board, we're looking at the same sort of thing as well. Because, you know, your tolerance level now has to, you know, increase a lot, doesn't it? Or decrease. Basically, we're not going to tolerate the sort of things that we did before just to fill the room, you know. And as managing agents, you know, you're always in that situation of, you know, you got to get the rooms filled, got to keep the landlord happy, got to get the rooms filled. But now it's not, you know, there's a lot of other things to consider. What other things are you doing or planning to do in and around renters' rights within the management business, I guess?
Yeah, so a lot of that is process-wise. So we've gone through our last round of property inspections for quite a while now, since we've known what was going to be included. Our property inspections have included, are there any trickle vents on the windows? So a lot of the new refurbs we're doing, if we change the windows, they come as standard. But a lot of the older double glazed windows don't have trickle vents, for example. So putting a trickle vent in at the end of the tenancy, £7 for a trickle vent, put that in at the end of an inspection. If there's windows that don't have them, put them in, because then if the damp and mold issue arises, the first thing the council's going to say is, what, you know, how ready is this property? Well, you haven't got a trickle vent. That's an easy thing. So that's a sort of practical thing. Process wise, we've had to think about how we're going to do rent reviews. So at the moment, we do rent reviews at the end of the fixed term. What we've tended to do is to say, let's say you rent for easy numbers, 500, landlord wants 550, or if you commit to a new contract, they'll do it at 525 for the next 6 months. So there's an incentive for the tenant to stay because they get a slightly cheaper rent. Now, obviously, all we can do going forward from the 1st of May is issue a notice that says this is what the rent's going to be. And the tenant will have the ability to go to the ombudsman and say, no, thanks.
Yeah.
And I mean, this ombudsman doesn't even exist yet. So how it's going to cope with all of that. So one of the things we're thinking is, okay, we've got a lot of rooms in the area. So we will be able to provide market comparables as to why we think these rooms are 550 now, not 500. So we will have to be better prepared with not just here's a notice that says what it's going to be, but here's the evidence as to why. And kind of, I mean, we're not going to say you can challenge it with the ombudsman, but they'll ask us what the market rent is, and here it is. But it's that kind of balance between, it's not just a figure that we've plucked out of thin air. Here's the background as to why. And, you know, you probably see the same, you know, some of our rents that we're advertising now are a little bit less than a year ago when there was a real surge in the rents. And actually, if we do rent reviews now, we would probably be bringing them down slightly, which obviously landlords aren't that keen. So we'll just leave it on the rolling contract. So I think there'll be a lot more review of things. And also, you know, at the moment, little things like our system automatically, when a tenant gives notice, will say, yeah, we've received that notice. It'll automatically ping the advert as available online. But what that does is it uses the old price. So if we've not already reviewed the price at some point in that tenancy, we've got to be careful that we don't advertise it at the old price and then go, oh, actually, that room is worth £100 more now because it was last advertised 3 years ago. Because once it's advertised, that's it, that's the price. So there'll have to be an approval process of the rooms becoming available. What do we think it's going to market for? Is the landlord happy to accept that that's where we start? And there will definitely be an increase in the rents that get advertised, and then potentially we'll nibble down at the price because we can only go down under the new rules. Whereas, you know, as before you'd advertise and you think, oh, that's popular. You know, if somebody offers it, and we don't get a lot of bidding, we're not really, in that market. Maybe if you're in a 3-bed terraced house and you've got 50 people that want it, you know what rooms are like. It's often first come, first served almost, as long as you pass referencing.
Yeah.
There's another room down the road. If you've got 2 people who want a room, cool, we can offer 2 rooms. So yeah, definitely that. So there's little sort of process changes that we'll have to implement that, but I think really where it will catch people out is the real old school agents that, you know, still haven't caught up with the 2029 and the 2022 changes. You know, still, I mean, we still see adverts now, you know, charging tenants to move in and stuff. And you think that was, you know, that was 2019, that was
Tenant
out.
fee ban, yeah.
Yeah.
Get the tenant fee ban, yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, a lot of it's just process really and quality. I think, you know, you've got some landlords are saying they'll step out, but, you know, we do a lot of end to end. So the sourcing, the refurb and the project management. So we haven't really got the same issues around if we take on third party landlords. You know, somebody walks in off the street and says, here's the keys to my house, can you let it? It hasn't had a refurb for 20 years. We don't really have that challenge in our managed book because we haven't got that dated stock to kind of go and have those difficult landlords to say, conversations to say to the landlord, look, you're probably not up to scratch now.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to ask if you're seeing a bit of an exodus, and perhaps not because of your model of that whole end-to-end process. We have a mix. We have the end-to-end stuff, but we do have also quite a bit of just, you know, will you do the management for us? We're not, I mean, we wouldn't really take on anything that's not up to scratch, particularly anyway. But what we are seeing is some landlords saying maybe this 4-bed HMO doesn't work for me anymore. So the transition back to family let. So we have seen that, you know, and we say you're right, you know, because I've got a whole bunch of 4 beds personally that are like barely washing its face. So we understand the situation that they're in and the decisions they've got to make. Really, it's sort of 6-bed and up is where it needs to be, really, isn't it? In terms of, unless you've got those studio rooms that are bigger and you're giving higher prices for or renting them at a higher rate. How has this affected your appetite for buying? Are you still full guns blazing, renters' rights, just a blip on the curve, or what's your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, you know, a lot of these things don't really affect where we're doing a brand new conversion of a building that would need planning anyway, because it's only percent. It's more the process changes. It's definitely woken some of our landlords up with some older properties, and in a way that kind of regenerates the market. We can go to a planning committee now and say we've actually reduced the number of HMO rooms in our town. We've increased the number of family let. So, you know, choose which thing you're going to beat us with. But and is that also then obviously for the market side of things, that's 50 less rooms and 50 more tenants. So our rents will have gone up slightly because the demand is there, because there's less supply and more demand. We've definitely seen an increase in average management fee as our rents have gone up slightly. The ensuite rooms rent for £150 a month more than the non-ensuite rooms, which means then that we've got fewer rooms to a property manager, but more revenue. So we can spend more time managing the property. So if neighbours or tenants have got, I won't say a complaint, but an issue that needs dealing with, we've actually got a bit more capacity to deal with it as well. So I do think completely unintentionally, the government have done a good thing and they'll sort of rejuvenate the housing market a bit and they will improve quality. I think there's a lot of unintended consequences that will happen, and that's the nature of any change. The big one for me, and it's a bugbear, the thing I think nobody's really talking about, particularly in HMOs, is the notice changing for the tenant from 1 month to 2 months.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, I think that's going to be, you know, the landlord's going to, I don't think loads of people are going to suddenly move out because they can, but I think when people give their 2 months notice, we're certainly going to say, okay, well, you owe us 2 months. And they're going to say, but I'm moving out next month because I'm moving to Crewe to get a new job and I've got my room with Amanda, you know, everything's all sorted. All I've got to do is pick up my bag and move. And we're going to be saying, but you owe 2 months rent. And we've only got a month's deposit and a little bit of that's going to go on cleaning. Yeah. So you're going to have a money claim online for a month and a half's rent.
Yeah.
And I think it's going to leave a bad taste in the mouth of good tenants.
Yeah.
Because the landlord's going to say, look, you've taken away my fixed term contract, so I do want my 2 months notice. And those good tenants that maybe been there 3 years are going to say, look, I've given you 3 months. And some landlords will take a different view on that, but I think, you know, some landlords are going to cling on to, well, that's all I've got left in terms of security of tenancy. So I'm going to ask for my 2 months notice. But the reality is, certainly in the HMO world, if you're in a family let, you know, you're going to move to another area, you're probably going to mention it to your landlord in advance because you're going to be thinking about schools for the kids and, you know, my job. It's a big thing to move house with a family, but to move from a room, you know,
It is
it's
pack your bag,
transient by
literally.
nature. Yeah.
Yeah, pack your bag. I think that's very true. And I was having a conversation with somebody two days ago actually on exactly the same thing. Because if somebody applies for a room now in one of our houses that's vacant to move in 2 months, I mean, I have to check whether I'm even allowed to say this or not. But basically the answer is no, we're not waiting for 2 months.
Yeah.
So you've then got to really start aligning. Now, if someone's, let's say the room's been sticking a bit, someone wants to move in say 3 or 4 weeks' time, you might take a punt on it if they're willing to sign maybe a 12-month contract or something. So it's going to be quite hard to align all of these 2-month dates, isn't it? And like you say, that word, that phrase, unintended consequences, keeps appearing a lot recently because there's going to be a whole bunch of things. And some of our tenants, for us, to be honest, even when they know it's a month, they kind of want to try and move out in about 2 weeks sometimes because
Yeah.
they're not moving generally because they want to. It's like, look, I've just got a new job, I need to go. You know, it's a practical decision, isn't it?
And a
So
lot of them are in jobs that, you know, you step out of the care work, you know, we have a lot of carers and things like
yeah,
that, that you're in agency, there is no real notice. You know, you just say, well, I've got another job at 50p an hour more and
yeah,
I'll start on Monday, and
yeah, yeah,
that's it. And because there's no tenant fee ban, we see literally people moving from one end of a road to the other because it's closer to work.
yeah,
Whereas 6 years ago, people would say, well, you know, it's going to cost me £250 to move in and
yeah.
I'll get the bus or I'll walk, I'll leave five
True,
minutes earlier. And
true. That's very
um,
true. And I think as well is, you know, as managing agents, as good as we all are, it's, you know, every now and again you still do get a little, you know, disgruntled tenant or with a bit of a grumble. And if you don't deal with this, they're just going to go, aren't they? But then again, I guess I still got to give 2 months, but there's no incentive really to stay and stick it out. Let's say you move in and there's a bit of a two tenants aren't getting on. There's not much of an incentive to try and maybe perhaps work it out and live together because you're living together for 6 months. People are just going to be
just give
off.
their notice
So
and go.
it's going to
But
be an interesting one. And I was thinking as well about viewings. Potentially, I mean, we have a slightly different model, but some agencies are going to have to do perhaps 2 to 3 more times viewings a year. Let's say if you're letting a room, maybe you have to let the room 3 or 4 times in a year at times rather than perhaps once. That's quite a change on the staffing requirement, isn't it? And just time and stuff like that.
yeah. And for us, we've never charged a tenancy setup fee. So we're a higher headline rate on rent collected. But
Yeah,
for us, we're looking to say, okay, well, if we're now letting that room, you know,
yeah,
maybe we don't let it 2 or 3 times a year every year, but
yeah. There'll be
there's a chance that, you know, say somebody moves in, so I don't really like it or whatever, and they can go. You know, we bear the cost of that, so the referencing, the viewing time, the commission for the agents, all that stuff. So our, you know, our financial model changes potentially because we maybe have those costs slightly more often.
yeah,
That said, I would say though that we're definitely post COVID. We're every year we're seeing our average tenancy length get longer and longer, and I
okay,
think that's, you know, maybe that's just unusual to us, but I would sort of say people are more choosing to live in HMOs rather than having to live in HMO. We've always talked about we want HMOs to be somewhere people choose to live rather than have to live.
yeah, good,
And I think some of that, you know, as the quality of HMOs get better, the room sizes get bigger, people settle, you know, but it becomes more the norm and it maybe becomes a bit less transient, which hopefully then the neighbours aren't complaining that they don't know who they're living next to. And,
yeah,
you know, it just becomes a bit like, you know, one
yeah,
bed flats 60, 40, 50 years ago. You know, people started living on their own in one bed flats rather than living with their parents, getting married and buying a house. And the first night they spend together is the night they own the home. It's, you know, maybe it's the same evolution that, you know, people
yeah.
live in rooms and they live in rooms for longer than before. I think also the all bills included model is
Very
that's the thing
attractive.
that a lot of tenants love.
Yeah,
How much am I paying? That's it.
yeah, yeah,
Wages come in, rent goes out,
yeah.
everything else is mine.
Yeah, especially in an economic climate where there is a lot of uncertainty, isn't there, for everyone, never mind those perhaps lower income workers. So totally. The last few guests that I've had on the podcast, Russ, I've finished with a question. And it's a question that I often get asked if I go to sort of family gatherings or friends that I haven't seen for a while. And the question usually comes up along the lines of, when are you going to stop doing this? And my answer is, probably never. And what's your exit plan? I don't know, in a box or something. But what do you think about the future? Do you think about an exit? Are you very much just present in the moment, in growth mode? I'd love to know your thoughts on that for you and your business.
Yeah, so I thought you were going to say how many houses have you got, because that's the one
Oh,
that you
yeah,
always
that's
get
the
as well,
second
isn't it?
question. That's the second question.
I think, yeah, we're kind of still in growth mode. I think we've got probably another few years of some of these bigger projects where we then end up with a portfolio that's a relatively small number of buildings, but a relatively high number of tenancies that are ours. I think we've kind of got to a point where with the office, we've just signed a lease on a bigger office. So we've kind of made the jump in the overheads that, if we were going to stop, we either need to stop last year or we need to keep growing.
Yeah.
I think with more and more areas choosing to go Article 4, the sourcing business, that's a risk. It's not imminent, but that may slow down our capacity to do things. And we might then need to look at going and winning business on the basis that we're the very best managing agent that just does rooms. So we're looking at, in terms of growth, do we need to bring a business development manager who is going out and winning the business? And our USP would be we do rooms. We don't do rooms that are mainly student rooms, and we do a few sharers, but we also do sales and we do family lets, and that's all the other agents. Nobody else, certainly in the big city near us, just does rooms. They do rooms and. In the very long term, I don't know if any of my team are listening to this, so I have to be very careful. But in the very long term, what I could see is if we do go down that road, we would probably build the managed business in an area where we don't own property to a point where we could then sell off that bit of rent-a-room. Maybe we get Coventry, for example, to 500 or 1,000 rooms, sell that off for quite a big chunk of cash, and then use that cash to pay down the debt in our portfolio so that we're then 30-40% loan to value on £2 million properties that cash flow 5, 6, 7,000 pounds a month, and we then downsize the office and we end up with a property manager, an administrator, and that's about it. I don't know, but that's especially if any of our landlords are listening, that is way down the track. That is a long way down. We're very much committed to growing what we've got sustainably. We've learned not to grab the management of anything that comes along, even if it's crap. We've learned not to take every tenant that walks through the door because it fills a room. We're focused very much on quality. And
yeah, I think for any management business, it's you either run it forever. What did somebody say to me the other day? They said you either get rid of it or it gets rid of you or something. I can't remember the phrase they said, but when it comes to management, so you get it to a point where it's very attractive and sell it, or perhaps eventually it just becomes a little bit of a burden, I think, as you get older, effectively. So I think the same for us, we want to grow it to the point it becomes very attractive for someone, knowing that our, I guess, wealth has been built over the property investment rather than the business. But I've been a big believer of growing businesses alongside property. I think as you have with the different businesses you and Lucy are involved in. And I think it plays quite an important role, and it enables the scale.
we definitely wouldn't have done the bigger project without the volume of rooms on the management side to prove that people are willing to pay a bit more, they want bigger rooms, they're willing to pay even more for that. So yeah.
Good. All right, now when you go to your next family gathering and people, the two questions, when are you going to stop, or how many have you got? We had an answer for the how many have you got, enough was always the answer, wasn't it? Or not enough. But yeah, but look, Russ, this has been great. I've really enjoyed this. This has been on the cards for a while, and I'm glad we've both penciled in the time to be able to do it. For anyone that's listening and thinks Russ is a superstar and I'd like to get hold of him or I'd like to follow him, where's best to catch you?
So Instagram, we're all the usual channels. So we've got an Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn is fine, Facebook. Personally, we've got Russ Dyble Property is my Facebook page. That's probably where we're most active on sharing what we're up to, properties that we've done, but also people give us feedback that we're very honest about when it doesn't go right. We're not in Dubai running around on a jet ski. So you
Oh,
won't see any of that.
what a shame.
You're much more likely to see us traipsing the mean streets of Nuneaton, doing site visits on big developments. So lots of very real content there, lots of honesty about what goes not quite to plan as well as what goes really well. So yeah, any of those channels, but Russ Dyble Property on Facebook is probably the easiest way to see what we're up to and then send a message.
Brilliant. Okay, well, I'll link everything in the show notes. Russ, you've been great, and I look forward to doing this again. Thank you.
Yeah, speak to you soon.